All right, it's that time again. No, good one. No, it's time for us. It's a good one. I'll admit that I considered it, but I thought I was a little mean to do one on Kant. So.
I'm pretty good at understanding things, but Kant is throwing me for a loop.
Yeah.
I think I know what he's talking about. Now I realize I am completely wrong.
Thank you. Yeah, that's not. I still sometimes have that feeling, so that's sort of part of the subject matter here. I like this a creative snaking pathway here going. Anyway, so if you remember, we were on track last time, so we're actually on to our schedule still. I doubt we'll keep it up today, but between now and Thursday we should be able to get through everything with Kant. What I asked you to do for today was to focus on a couple of passages, a couple of sections in particular, 8, 42, 44, the top of my head. And so we're going to do a little bit of close reading. I've got the passages on the slides coming up. But so I want to talk to you about what you think exactly is going on in those passages, because condensed and confusing as they are, a lot of Kant's argument about the state and a lot of his argument against Locke, for example, is packed into those passages. So, just your quick overview. This is what ultimately he's trying to do, right? So we're going to talk today about why Kant thinks that the state is morally mandatory. Last time we talked about external freedom, rights, and that being the business of the state. And now he's going to say, well, that's what the state is, and if you understand what the state is, which is the thing that occupies itself with guaranteeing external freedom, then, or our rights, which protect us from external freedom, then you can see he's going to say why the state is morally mandatory. So it's not an optional thing. Right? Locke tells you state is optional. State of nature, it stinks, so if you're smart and rational and you seek to make your life better, you probably will consent, but unless you do consent, there can be no authority in the state of nature. Okay? That's the natural freedom and equality with which he starts. And so that's what generates the whole need for the consent theory. That's why he needs to give you a tacit consent theory, which seems like a stretch maybe. But you know, he needs it because unless he can give you something like the tacit consent theory, he doesn't have a theory of authority at all. Why? Because he needs to show that we voluntarily accept the state. Ultimately, it's optional. Not so for Kant. Kant thinks this is a huge mistake. State of nature, it's impossible to have rights. It's a situation without justice, much like Hobbes. But where Hobbes thought this is just sort of like a good instrumental, really rational thing, like if you want to be safer, then you choose the state. Kant thinks, no, this makes the state morally mandatory. Like you have a duty to join the state, and in fact, you can be forced into the state. If you don't like it, they'll come and get you. We know that's a fact. What Kant thinks is not just a fact, that's how it should be. Right? So we talked a little bit about Thoreau, the other classes. Thoreau goes to Lake Walden, doesn't want to pay his taxes, right? He says, I don't consent. On a Lockean theory, it's a question whether he has a right or not, depends whether the tacit consent thing works or not. But let's say that he doesn't consent, then the state is doing him wrong when they come and get him and throw him in jail for not paying his taxes. The state should leave him alone. On Kant's view, the state is doing exactly what it should be doing. Thoreau is on the wrong. And the arguments from these sections that we'll look at today explain, if everything goes well, they explain why. Right? So, state of nature, no rights. In civil society, that's where we can have rights, and there only we can have rights. And then he thinks that because of these, somehow this is going to lead to an argument that you can actually be forced into the state. Now, there's a bunch of premises he's missing here, right? Like this is not exactly following yet, but Kant thinks, if you really think about it, it will follow. So that's what we'll be doing. You'll see that there's a lot of stuff that Kant is talking about appropriation in the state of nature, a lot of sections about property and so on, claiming something external to be mine and so on. And so as Kant presents it, there is a lot turns on this argument about property rights, but modern day Kantians, sort of people who follow Kant today, they tend to, well, they like this argument too, but it's just, they don't think that's the only argument. They think he also has an argument from disagreement. And if you've read Ripstein for today, You'll see Ripstein runs both those arguments together. It's one part is about property, the other is about disagreement. The disagreement thing doesn't really appear much in the text. There is actually one sentence where it is, and they jump on that sentence. But it's an interesting sentence, so there you go. I hope you liked the Ripstein reading. I know it was a little long, but it's very clear, and I think it's really well, it's the best thing explaining Kant out there, and it's not even close. So almost all the other secondary literature on Kant is about as baffling and unpenetrable as Kant himself. But then Ripstein comes out, and it's just really, he just uses normal language and clear sentences and things like that. So it helps. All right, so I asked you to read section 8. I want to read it together with you. And I've chopped it up in bits, because it's a super dense section. I hope you've read it and studied it. But let's read it together. So it starts this way, right? So when I declare by word or deed, I will that something external is to be mine, I thereby declare that everyone else is under an obligation to refrain from using that object of my choice, an obligation no one would have were it not for this act of mine to establish a right. So he's talking about appropriating things, right? Like suppose you look some type of state of nature, things aren't owned yet, some land, there's some trees, there's some pieces of wood, what have you, right? And you say, I want this one. This is going to be this piece here. This is going to be mine. Like I claim it. We'll see later in term. Locke, one of the most famous part of Locke's second treatise is chapter 5, which we haven't looked at. It's far the longest chapter he has, and it's all about property. And Locke says, if it's unowned and you work on it by improving it by like using your labor, it's yours. That's it. It's a theory. It's about as good a theory as we have. Kant says when you do that, right, so this is just a description of what you're doing. When I declare by word or by deed, so either just I say, hey, this is going to be mine, or I work on it, or whatever else you might think, maybe sit on it, dance around it, whatever the theory says, right? Doesn't matter. I will that something external is to be mine, so something external has to be something physical again, right? Like just with external freedom. I thereby declare that everyone else is under an obligation to refrain from using that object of my choice. Necessarily, right? That's just what it is to say I have a right, property right now just means everybody else has to stay off unless you're trespassing on my property. Right? Okay. An obligation they wouldn't have were it not for this act of mine, right? So there's something new that's happened, that's appearing on your landscape. Yesterday you were okay to sort of like do this, right? Now if you do it, I say, hey, stay away, it's mine, right? Changed. All right. So far so good? Just saying this is what happens, right? The argument from property. All right. So this is just the next sentence. Like I said, I've chopped it up, right? In the text, it comes here. So this claim, meaning the claim on the object, involves, however, acknowledging that I am in turn under an obligation to every other to refrain from using what is externally his. For the obligation here arises from a universal rule having to do with external rightful relations. All right, and now I'm going to flip it around. What is he saying? What is this about? I did the easy part, which was the description, right? Here the philosophy comes in, so now it's your turn. What is it? Tyler? No, come.
To expect someone to respect your claims on something, you can have to respect their claims on things.
Yeah, right? So you have to, if you expect others to respect your right or their claims, or they have to respect their obligations towards you, which is pretty just two sides of the same coin, right? Then you have to do the same to them, right? Why?
Because then you have no reason to expect them to respect your claims.
So why can't I just expect you to respect my claims?
Because if you don't respect theirs, then they're not going to respect yours.
Mm-hmm. Dominic?
Yeah, I was just going to say that you have to respect, I have to respect your claim, you respect my claim. It helps us operate under the universal rules of external rights, which he's trying to establish right here. Because if you expect me to respect your right to your piece of property, but you don't have that same obligation to me, then it seems to be by like choice or taste that you're operating under the rule of the world.
Right. Yeah, I'm pushing on this because as we'll see, there is a moment here where it's unclear whether we're doing real Kant or some Hobbes. Here's what I mean, right? Like Hobbes thinks in the state of nature things are really crappy, and it's giving you just like a self-interested reason, right? So if you like your right to be secure, if you would like to be able to trust others, then you'd better trust them. That's just those are your most effective means to get what you want, right? That's the Hobbesian route. And we'll see Kant uses this a little. But we also talked about last time that Kant is really trying to do a different type of project, right? He's trying to give you reason as this sort of thick moral legislating device that we have in our minds, right? From which ethics and philosophy falls. And so if he means that, then there has to be something more than just this is prudentially smart or something, right? And it has to be. So what he's saying probably is, I think this is what Dominic was referring to, like this last part, is just like for the obligation here arises from a universal rule having to do with external rights relation. The universal rule being a rule of reason or something, right? And reason being general in its nature, so it applies to people who are alike. You treat like cases alike. That's a reasonable thing to demand. And so if you just expect others to respect your rights, but you don't want to do that in reverse, you don't want to respect their rights in turn, then you're just being inconsistent, right? See, these are the same things, my right, your right, they're both rights. Why would people have, why would there be moral reason to respect rights? Well, because there is this rule that we should respect rights, but that rule applies generally, so if it applies to mine, it applies to yours, right? And if you think, I get to claim stuff, but I don't respect your claims, then I'm making an exception. And that's not allowed by full reason, right? It might be allowed, of course, by this instrumental thing, right? That's why Hobbes had this problem with the fool, if you remember. We talked a little bit about it. Right? The fool says, why don't I try and act in such a way that everybody else respects people's rights and I get to cheat, right? That gives me the best of all possible payoffs. And Kant says, well, that's not the sort of that might be rational in sort of the very narrow game theory or economics term, but it's not reasonable in the more thick sense. Like, this is what reason does. Right? Okay. Bill, you had your hand up a second ago?
No, I was just going to say
okay. Yeah.
I was going to say, perhaps another way, or maybe not another way, but a different way to think about it is you have an obligation to do unto others as you would like them to do unto you.
Yeah, exactly. Kant thinks that what he calls the categorical imperative, which is really sort of the foundational rule of reason that gives you all of morality, he says. The golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, is a very good approximation of that. It's not quite the same. You can get philosophical, and I can point out ways that they don't map, and that's for the worse of the golden rule. But yeah, as an approximation is good. And so Kant thinks that's actually why most people understand. We all have reason, and so we all sort of dimly see the truth because we have reason before we really do philosophy. But yet, to get it precise, you have to do philosophy. But yeah. Right, and so he thinks, well, if you're going to be reasonable, you have to understand that something like the golden rule is true. And so now if I'm claiming a right for myself, then by the golden rule, I have to respect the rights of others. Right? And similarly, to go to the flip side, if I'm expecting others to sort of comply with their obligations towards me, which is just what it is, to claim a right against them is that they have an obligation. That's by the beginning here, right? Then I, in turn, have to respect my obligations towards them. It's just the same as me saying I have to respect their rights. The rights are only relevant insofar as they put obligations on me. Your right to your body is no good if it doesn't put an obligation on me not to touch you without your consent. Right? Still get to do everything I want. You say, well, I have a right. That doesn't really change anything, right? So you need the obligation and the right attached to each other. Okay. So far, so good? Any questions so far about what's going on? All right, next one. So, I am therefore not under an obligation to leave external objects belonging to others untouched unless everyone else provides me with assurance that he will behave in accordance with the same principle with regard to what is mine. This assurance does not require a special act to establish a right, but is already contained in the concept of an obligation corresponding to an external right, since the universality and with it the reciprocity of obligation arises from a universal rule. This is like vintage Kant, right? Like so there's a bunch of stuff packed into 3 sentences. It's like you're reading like, oh, jeez. Just go. He does not go easy on his reader, right? All right, so step by step. What do you think is going on here? So he said you cannot claim a right unless you would also respect other people's rights. And then what's it?
I think he's trying to make a distinction between his thought and Hobbes' thought, because where Hobbes would say you can't really have external objects because of other people in self-interest. Kant's trying to say that the whole idea of external objects doesn't really make sense because you don't have this foundation of this universal rule first established, and you need that universal law in place first so that you know that they'll reciprocate what you have intended as well. And then from there, so it's like he kind of works bottom up here with this. He's first laying out the problem, and he's laying out how it's supposed to work. We do this universal rule. Well, it doesn't seem like we have this universal rule, and the assurance of this universal rule is the same nature, so you can have external things.
Yeah, good. So he definitely does think that for you to have rights, there has to be something like that universal rule of respect and assurance, or a guarantee of some sense. It has to be in place, right? Of course, in place is not exactly the most precise term, right? In place where, in place how, by who, right? Here's a simple answer, right? It's in place because it's in our reason, right? That's it. Well, why does that not work? He doesn't think it works. He seems to want something more, right? He wants more than just that reason requires that you leave other people's stuff alone. He wants to say that there has to be some type of assurance, right? There's a puzzling thing here going on, like, I am therefore, right? Like, so there's an implication suggested here that comes from on the one hand, you see, I cannot claim a right for myself consistently without also respecting your people's, like, your rights. Okay, that's fine. So now I think if I'm going to claim this for myself, then I have to respect what you claim for yourself. Okay, so far so good. I am therefore, right, because of that, not under an obligation to leave your stuff alone, right, unless everybody else provides me assurance that they'll leave my stuff alone as well. That's a bizarre, I don't know, that's me that trips up, right? And he says this assurance, the assurance that we're looking, does not require a special act to establish a right. So it doesn't really require me claiming anything or working on it or dancing around it, whatever might be the appropriation thing, right? But it's already contained in the concept of an obligation. That's just the idea of owning something, right? And requiring people that they don't touch it. Like me being required not to mess with your stuff, that idea itself requires that I'm only required to to not mess with your stuff if everybody else can give me an assurance to do the same thing too. Right? And it's supposed to somehow follow from this. I have a suggestion on the next slide why, but it's not quite clear, right? Since, here's the explanation, right? The universality, and with it the reciprocity of obligation. So basically the idea that we all are under obligations towards each other and alike, if we are, right, arises from a universal rule. So the idea that there is this consistency idea, this golden rule idea, right, that if we're going to claim rights and obligations, then we have to apply them sort of symmetrically, right, like everybody is under them alike. That seems to suggest he thinks that we need these assurances. Rationally, right? Not, of course, there's a simple answer for why this would be like why Hobbes would think this, right? It's really stupid to like just trust that everyone will leave your stuff alone unless you have some, because you're making yourself very vulnerable, right? That's why he says in a state of nature you shouldn't be like plowing your fields and growing nice fruits and stuff because they'll just attract the predators, right? But that's not supposed to be, this is supposed to be part of the concept, right? Any thoughts why he thinks this?
Why it's part of the concept?
Yeah, why does Kant think this idea of assurance follows from the like? If it's not just like it's the most effective means to get what you want, but it's part of the idea of like the golden rule idea, right? Like living consistently with each other.
Guess the assurance is that since like if you would want to have possession over some like object, well then other people do too. So your assurance is that you can be assured that because they want some other object and they don't want to have to like worry about you taking it, you can be sure that they won't try and take yours, not just because they're like nice or whatever, but because they want to keep their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so.
Yeah, maybe. So actually, Hobbes. So Kant himself goes quite. The next section is actually being very Hobbesian with Kant. It's puzzling. We'll get back to this later. But you might be right that that was what he originally had in mind.
Without this idea of equal assurance, there's no protection from any encroachments on your rights or whatever the property that is that you decide you want to claim for yourself.
Yeah, good. So there can't be any, without the assurance, there is no real protection, right? Why does that matter?
Because if there's no assurance that there's any real protection, then any encroachment can happen because in essence you don't really have property.
Ah, good. Good. So the idea, nice. So you're thinking like, well, it's Kant likes ideas, right? like argue from the idea of something, and so the idea of property is owning some, not just claiming something, but there being some type of protection over your claim or something. And that protection can't exist unless we are sort of equally bound to respect each other's claims or something. Right. Yeah, that might be actually closer, I think, to what Kant had in mind. Part of what's going on here, just as a piece of background, is Kant seems to have been sort of like a really developing part in Kant's thought. If you look at Kant's earlier writings, the essay Towards Perpetual Peace, for example, which he writes about international relations, why he thinks, he writes that the state of nature will be one in which there will be a lot of fighting. So he really uses he just lifts Hobbes' theory. And then in some sections, including section 8 here, the earlier sections in the Doctrine of Right, you still get that argument. But then later in the Doctrine of Right, 42, 44, you'll see it changing. So it looks like he was trying to work out exactly how the argument went. And so we'll see first, in some ways he goes Hobbesian, and then in some ways later, not so much. And maybe you're picking up more on the full Kant, so to speak. All right. So here it goes, right? Now a unilateral will cannot serve as a coercive law. Unilateral will just means like your personal will, right? Privately, what you think and what you want. You're claiming this, right? So you claim this table here. That cannot serve as a coercive law for everyone with regard to possession that is external and therefore contingent, since that would infringe upon the freedom in accordance with the universal laws. So he thinks your freedom should be governed by this rule of we're equally protected by the freedom, and then I come along and I say, aha, now all of you can't go use this table anymore, but I can, right? So I'm disrupting this sort of equality between us. I'm saying, like, I get to decide what the rules of morality are, and yesterday they were one way, they said everyone can use this, and now they favor me and not you. And he thinks, well, that can't be, right? Amongst equals, we don't have that power. Okay, so it is only a will putting everyone under an obligation, hence a collective or general, common, and powerful will that can provide everyone this assurance. Notice that for those of you who were with me last term, general will is not a coincidence. Right? That's a Rousseau reference. If you don't. The condition of being under a general or public law giving, accompanied with power, is the civil condition. So only in the civil condition can something externally be mine or yours. So he says, well, if I can't by myself claim this thing here, because that would sort of upset our equality or our freedom, and I can't do that because that's just my individual unilateral will, and my individual will I cannot legislate what morality allows, right? What rights there are, what your obligations are. Well, unilaterally you can't do that, but of course if we can somehow bind all of our wills together into a law that then apportions to all of us with some sort of equal respect or whatever, who owns what, well then it's not just my will, then it's all of our wills together. That's the solution to this problem. But he says, aha, guess what? What do we call a situation in which that is true? That's what we call a civil condition. So he thinks the state does that. Right? That's the argument for the state. Only in the state are all of our wills united. And so then we can have rights and obligations that don't involve me just telling you guys what to do and bossing you around, and you telling me what to do and bossing me around. Everyone bossing everyone around. Right? a mess, morally speaking. Even if it's peaceful, it's still a mess, morally speaking. But then we are all united through the law, and the law gives us one nicely determinate answer, and so that respects us all equally, and so then there is not this weird sort of bossing around and power difference things. And that's what the state does.
Is Kant's idea of the collective or the collective will, a powerful will, as rigid as Rousseau's is? It's not like as unanimous as what Rousseau is. I hope not.
What do you mean?
Because the idea with Rousseau seemed to be that for a general will, it has to be unanimous. Kant is not asking for a unanimous general will in this case. It's just saying the collective, meaning people getting together.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, well, so Rousseau thinks that the general will is whatever gets decided by a unanimous vote, right? So if we all vote, we vote on one rule over another, then that one rule will respect all of our wills because we all agree to it, right? And he actually thinks that's nice because we all be sort of acting the better parts of our wills if we do that, right? Yeah, Kant is similar in that regard, but he doesn't think that we have to vote on everything, right? But he does think that the state is something that once it's properly in place will respect all of our wills similarly to necessarily, right? Because through the law-giving mechanism, the legislature or whatever, we are all joined there. So think about a democracy, right? A democracy, everyone votes for people who then make rules in our name. Well, what we're doing is we are joining our wills to somebody else to act as our agent, who then makes a decision in our names, well, meaning just as an expression of our wills. Right? And then whatever rule gets decided by them, that reflects our wills. Right? And it's not just my will, it's not just your will, and it's not just mine and your will. Right? It's given that we all live together under one system that does this together, it's something sort of higher, he thinks. And so that's similar to Rousseau too, right? Like this gets some sort of a life of its own. It doesn't have to be a democracy, right? If we just vote into place some type of ruler, then we're doing basically. We can tell 300 people that whatever they decide will reflect our wills. We can tell 2 people, right? We can tell 1 people. But that's sort of generally the structure of the law.
Kant still thinks you can be forced to be free using Rousseau's terms, though, right?
He does, yeah.
Because he says that like you can be compelled under condition, which
Yes.
rights are secured.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's like the only real difference is it doesn't have to be unanimous, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in some ways, he's even more rigid than Rousseau. He thinks he allows for a lot more different kinds of societies that all would still be necessarily right. And so, in all those cases, as we'll see next time, there is no right to disobey either, because it's necessarily guaranteed to be right. How could it? Whereas Rousseau, at least, we can see like if it wasn't right by unanimous rule, well, it's a simple reason why the law would not have the authority that it otherwise would. But Kant, no, it still has the authority, just because it's a state. Yeah. But yeah, Rousseau was all over this, basically. You can see the imprint. All right. So, I've separated this into 2 slides because the argument is kind of like long once you start separating it. Well, we just saw, I think. A bunch of steps. So, first step, necessarily. So it means as a matter of the concept, right? Claiming a right to something, this table, right, means claiming that others are under an obligation, and a forcible one, to respect it. Why is it enforceable? Well, remember what he means by right. Right? So that's just the kind of thing that we're talking about. He starts off the book by saying, right, I'm talking about right insofar as it corresponds to an obligation. And then later he says, right involves the permission to coerce. So whenever we use the word right, we are referring to something that has an obligation attached to it for others that can be enforced. Necessary, right? Which is part of the concept. Necessary truth. Could not be otherwise. All right, step 2. Reason requires, right, that if you claim a right for yourself, you must also respect that others have enforceable rights against you, and vice versa, that you have enforceable obligations. That's that golden rule thing, right? Just the consistency. If you use reason, you'll see that because you're invoking a right is a concept, right? That concept applies only under this universal rule. It's a generally applicable concept. So if I have rights, well then you can have rights too, and then whatever is true of my right has to be true of your right as well. So basically, you invoke the idea of a right, and so as such you must recognize the validity of rights in general. That's what's going on here. So far so good? This is the easy part, I guess. All right. Then the step, it's unreasonable that you require that others, or you, right, respect people's rights, unless you or they, right, have the assurance that they or you will respect you or their rights. Right? Flipping it up and down, right? Why? Here's the Hobbesian moment, right? No one is bound to refrain from encroaching on what another possesses if the other gives him no equal assurance that he will observe the same restraint towards him. No one, therefore, need wait until he has learned by bitter experience of the other's contrary disposition. So he says once that assurance isn't there, maybe he's doing the Hobbes thing, right? It's too dangerous. Maybe he's doing the thing that Cameron was suggesting, which is, well, you know, if we're talking about property rights, then there's supposed to be this protection, and if the protection isn't there, then you don't have to wait to find out. Right? If others will just sort of happily be not attacking you and not stealing your stuff. But this is kind of, so far this is the linchpin, right? This seemed pretty good. If maybe there are some problems with it, if you really want to take an advanced ethics class, you can poke some holes into whether 2 really is true. 1 you can claim by definition. 2 is a little more tricky, but okay. 3 is going to be 3 is becoming more tenuous, right? Is it really unreasonable? We'll get to this later, but is it really unreasonable to require that others respect your rights only if you have the assurance that they will respect your rights too? Like, just flagging, this might not be as solid a foundation as Kant thinks. Anyway, so if you buy all these things, right? This is by definition. This looks pretty good, golden rule-ish stuff. Let's go for a moment with this, right? That it really is unreasonable to expect other people to respect your rights unless they have an assurance that you will respect yours. You will respect theirs in return. And it's unreasonable to think that they ought to respect your rights unless, and so on. So that then, if you buy all these things, well then it follows, right, that no one can claim a right unless everyone else gives them the assurance that rights in general will be respected. Right? That we will live under this rule of respect. All right? Now you can see the trouble, right? Can you see the trouble? Can you guess what the trouble is once we accept 4? Like how this might lead to a problem for the state of nature? How might this be, this is going to lead to, Kant is going to tell you the state of nature has problems, right? And it has something to do with this claim in 4 here. Asking if you want to take a guess, Will?
Oh, so is it, okay, good. So I was saying that, what I got from the reading was that he says that you can't have rights in the state of nature because what he describes right here, without technically saying that you're leaving it, he just kind of goes into it and then says, and now you're out of the state of nature. He says that you can't really have any rights because you can't really have possession over something unless you also agree that if someone else says they have possession over something, that you won't touch their thing. Well, right now that's like an agreement between you two, or between everyone. So right there, that's kind of the society, so you're not really in the state of nature anymore. So upon agreeing that you're going to let them have their claim of an object, and they're going to let you have your claim of an object, right there is a social contract right there. You're agreeing and they're agreeing not to touch your stuff.
Right.
So that's not the state of nature anymore.
So I think that's right, and there's one small part in which you're wrong. Yeah. So I think the general story you're telling is exactly right.
Yeah.
But the one small part is the last little bit where if you and I, let's say this classroom is a state of nature, right? No government between all of us. Yet there I am claiming this table. Kant says it's a real big problem because apparently, if we accept all these things, right, I really can't claim this right unless I can somehow give the assurance that everyone here will respect each other's rights. This is what I was saying. You can now see the problem. Like how can I do that? Right? How can I'm not that strong. I'm not that special. I don't have moral powers to make you respect or whatever, right? So that's going to be the trouble, right? But when you say like, okay, let's say you and I, like I say, it is my table, right? You say, okay, well, I'll agree to respect your right to the table Will says, Bas, I'll respect your table if you, Bas, will respect my Will's table. Right? And I say, yeah, sure, let's do it. Shake hands or something. Sign a contract, whatever. That still is not good enough for Kant. He says that's just a bilateral agreement. There's a sentence in what we read, one sentence where he refers to it. So it's easy to miss. But he thinks what really needs to be done, the only way we can get out of it, like we can have, all of us can have agreements with each other. We can have like, I can have an agreement with you and with you and with you and with you and with you, with you, with you, with you. And then you can have an agreement with him and with him and with him, with him and her, with her, and then with me, right? Everyone can have like these type of contracts with everybody, still wouldn't be good enough. Because these are just separate agreements we have with each other, and what we need is for all the wills to be united into one, which is what the state can do. We need some sort of unit that binds it all together into not just, think about it as like, you can have a bunch of sticks, right? And you can bind them together into a bundle and really tightly, and then you have it looks like a bigger stick, but it's still just a bunch of sticks tied together, right? That's if we all had our wills in bilateral agreements. Or you can melt down, like if it were metal, right? You can melt them down and pour it and forge it into one big new bar, and then it's one whole, right? A new thing. It's not just a bunch of sticks tied together into what looks like a bigger stick, but it's one stick. So the state is like the one big stick in which our wills are melted together, whereas all these agreements would be like the bundle of sticks tied together. And so the argument goes, a bundle won't do. What we need is a melted new full stick.
Pretty great metaphor.
Yeah, did it work? Yeah.
Until if you did something like metal rods, that would have been awesome.
Metal rods?
Burn sticks.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
That was good.
I was thinking about using metal sticks, but then who uses metal sticks? So.
I guess the problem that Kant sees is even if you don't have a state of injustice like Hobbes was envisioning, where everyone's just stabbing each other and just killing people, even if you have, at the very least, you're going to have a state of nature that's devoid of justice.
Yes,
where
exactly.
That if you stake claim to that table, there's nothing that's like an arbiter to keep me from making my claim to that table. Sort of like Senkaku Islands or something, or Dainasu Islands. People might have claims to it, but there's competing claims. There's no, especially in international, there's no world police to say, you know what, let's evaluate these claims, let's see who's really got claims to these particular islands.
Right.
It's sort of like what you get with anarchy.
Yeah, exactly. So Kant tries to make a big deal out of that, right? Because you can see how theoretically he's uncharitably, you might say, catching himself, like moving himself into a contradiction, right? So he wants to say, right comes from reason, right? So reason is everywhere. Like we have reason in the state of nature in civil society. So presumably right is everywhere, right? State of nature in civil society. If I kill you, I violate your rights in the state of nature and in civil society. And he wants to say, yeah, sure. And so there can be injustice in the state of nature when we kill people or something. Right? And also, there can be no injustice in the state of nature if we all happen to be like the nicest people in the world and we just like leave each other alone. But even if there was no injustice, yes, let literally use this sentence, right? Like, and it would still be devoid of justice. And he wants to say that because the state is supposed to be the only thing that gives us real justice. Right? And of course, the argument looks confusing because he's trying to forge those two together into one theory, right? And it's not clear whether he can do. Now, as a matter of interpretation, this is part of Kant's method, right? The dialectic method generally he thinks, German idealists generally think that the way insight progresses is by you start with one idea, and then it sort of morphs into its opposite. Then you look like you have a contradiction, and then you see how arises from the contradiction a higher truth that's then so thesis, antithesis, and then the synthesis that sort of overcomes the initial opposition. You find this in Marx, you find this in Hegel, you find this in all So that's why you see these sort of seeming contradictions happening as part of their method. That's the charitable way of saying it. The uncharitable way is saying he's just, makes no sense because it's contradictory, but that's what's going on, yeah. But so, the argument is going to be something about, even if there was no injustice, because we all respect each other's rights, there is still something lacking, something justicey, I'll put it later, justicey lacking, which would be if we had this type of assurance, right? Then we have a higher impartial public power that guarantees not just that our rights in fact are not violated, but guarantees publicly that our rights won't be violated. And that's better. Right? And when you don't have it, in that sense it's devoid of justice. Yeah.
So the state's power to enforce.
Now, right?
Yeah.
I called you Marshall a couple weeks ago.
Oh,
That's the last one.
But the state's power to enforce, that's the insurance that we need. That's the
Yes.
insurance that we need.
Well, not just to enforce, right? But it's to enforce a particular thing. And the thing being the united will of all of us. So I can enforce my will on you if I'm strong enough. Right? And you can enforce your will on me if you're strong enough. What sets the state apart, what makes it so special, is that it has the power to enforce the wills of all bound together in what he calls an omnilateral will. So it's not unilateral, it's not bilateral, it's not multilateral, which would be if we all had these bunch of contracts with each other. No, you have omnilateral is something better. It's that new thing. Right? Still alive? Okay. All right. So last step was, right, we can only really claim a right if we can assure people that rights in general will be respected. However, you cannot unilaterally give the assurance that other people, like that everyone in general will respect people's rights, because your wills aren't subject to my will. Right? Can't, morally speaking, but also factually speaking, I can't will for you. And I can definitely not will for you and respect you as a free and independent person at the same time, which is what Kant thinks you have to do. And so he thinks a unilateral will cannot serve as a coercive law for everyone. Right? That's the passage we just read. So, therefore, there cannot be, no one can unilaterally claim a right to anything. Which is what Kant's trying to say. Right? I can't legislate this for you. Are you still, I see some frowns. You need me to go back? All right, so here, 7, necessarily in a state of nature, we all act on our unilateral wills. That's just by definition, right? That's how he defines a state of nature, is where we just, each is acting for their own. And so therefore, in a state of nature, no one can claim a right to something. You can own things provisionally, which is then another confusing thing. It's not quite clear what that means, but set that aside. Probably he means, like, it's a very good imitation thing of the real deal. Like, you can go through all, you can have all the hallmarks of full property and ownership and so on, but it will lack that last justicey element of protection or the state or whatever. And so then if we create a state, then with the state, then those things sort of fall into their places, right? So you can provisionally sort of set them up as like sort of getting a head start on when the civil society is created, but it's not really fully there, or something like that.
So like a second-class ownership?
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, I think that's right. The puzzle, I mean, this is a really puzzling part in Kant. I mean, it's not like second class how, like what's the, does it mean you just get to take it, right? Like, no, it doesn't mean that, apparently, because then I wouldn't own it at all, right? So does it mean I don't get to protect it? No, because right has force built into it, right? Does it mean you do me no wrong if you steal it? No, right? Because I'm still, so what does it mean, right? Does it mean anything, like, I mean, it means that the state doesn't exist, but, okay. I thought I couldn't really claim something, right? And it's not, anyway. It's very difficult to make sense of this part of Kant, but Let's just set that aside. For all we care, maybe he's wrong to say that we can provisionally own things. Right? We're not interested in the ownership theory here. All right, the final steps here. The only way to give that you can give assurance that everyone will respect everyone's rights is by uniting everyone's wills and enforcing them. That's what the state does, called an omnilateral will, through its coercive legislation, right? We have a legislation that comes from the state in which we're all joined together through the social contract. The state uses force, right? Tells us what we all want, how we are all to live together, backs it up with some force. That's what you want. Right? Now we have the extra layer, the actual the real justice part. And so therefore, you can only really claim things in a state of in a civil condition. So lengthy argument packed in section 8, and I'm referring to a couple of things from section 14, but that's roughly, I think, what's going on. Problem with the state of nature is when we try to create these rights for ourselves, we are unilaterally trying to make a moral claim. And if you really think about what a moral claim is, then you'll see you can't unilaterally do this. This has to be done by everyone together at the same time, somehow, if it's going to respect us all. Okay. Any questions about this? There better be, because it's puzzling. But. Yeah.
I guess it's up to the state to decide what kind of enforcement is going on. Can people vote on the enforcement, or does the state just decide?
Can you give an example of what you're wondering about?
Like for instance, I forget what country, but it's in the Middle East where if you steal, you get your hand chopped off.
Oh, you mean, okay, you mean on the punishment?
Yeah,
right.
different states have different punishments. So, I don't know. It just seems like if it's universal, it seems like all states should have the same punishments.
Good. Yeah, and Kant has a theory of punishment, so he does think that that right, or reason, sets a norm for how things ought to be punished. So if the state is going to be fully just, it better follow the norm. The norm is an eye for an eye, so it's retributivism, so you have to give retribution for the wrong done. So you measure how wrong the stealing is. It's 17 units of wrong, right? And then you find a punishment that represents 17 units of wrong, right? It's like equivalent to it. And then you throw that onto the wrongdoer, and that balances the scale again. Right? That's the idea. So yeah, there's a determinate, there's a very clear answer to how you ought to punish. Now you might wonder, what if they do it differently? Maybe stealing and chopping off a hand is disproportionately, like it's not.
Or it seems too harsh.
Right.
Like, Kant, correct me if I'm wrong, but Kant believes that you should not rise up against government if
Right.
it gets too powerful. I guess people just have to deal with it. It doesn't,
Yeah.
I don't like it. It's just,
No, but you get all this justice in return. Yeah, so there are, I mean, you're right, first of all. That's, I think, the implication. If the state starts punishing disproportionately, scary, worrying, problematic, etc., but you don't get to resist. You know, it's not like Locke. Like Locke would have said, look, these people are overstepping the boundaries of their authority. You're off the hook, right? You get to resist if you can safely do so, and like, try and replace them with better people.
yeah, it seems like it is that you're trapped. The state, it seems like they have the power to just keep upping punishment. It's like,
Yeah, you are.
maybe like in the first few years or so, you get put in jail for a few days, increasing you months, years, and eventually execution. It seems like there's nothing to stop the state.
Right. Yeah, this is a product of the following, right? Like, I could have, thought this was confusing enough, but I could have, like, Kant thinks these things are necessary truths, right? So the conclusion, assuming that necessary truths reproduce through an argument, which sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but I could have entered here like, therefore, necessarily in a state of nature. Right? You cannot really claim a right to something. And then in the end, therefore, necessarily by virtue of the concepts involved. Right? People can only claim rights to things in a civil condition. And so later it'll say, like, whatever the state, basically the idea is, in a civil condition, the rights you can claim are the ones that the state grants you. Right? Necessarily. And so, yeah, you don't get to resist. It's not because Kant likes bullies or like draconian law so much. He just thinks the concept, like, so that's why you can't have any escape, right? It's not like it'll be dangerous like Hobbes thinks. It's just there is no room for this in philosophically. So yeah, so that's. But what if it no? Right? It can stop you right there. There is no answer. There is no but.
So the state can just own us. Basically, like they can claim rights to our lives.
Well, they can and they can't, right? They can't do it with justice, but you just don't get to resist, is there? Right? Like from your standpoint, you have to operate within the mechanisms of the state, because as soon as you step out of it, you're stepping into this condition devoid of justice. Because outside of the state is the state of nature. And so, how can you, as a rational person with the capacity of reason, who is therefore committed to right and justice and so on, how can you choose injustice over justice? That's what Kant thinks. Now, modern day Kantians think there are ways to sort of finagle your way out of this, right? You might think that if the state gets unjust, then we're compared with injustice and devoid of justice, whatever, like non-justice or something. And then maybe non-justice can sometimes be better than injustice, right? So there might be ways you can get it. But for Kant himself, no. Right?
So there is no neutral ground.
Yes, no.
It's like injustice is bad, justice is good.
Right. And then by definition, what the state does constitutes justice, so there is no room for resistance in that case. Now the weird thing is, he thinks like if you can't have the right to resist, but then if you do resist and you overthrow the government and you put new people in place, then those are just equally as just as the previous one, right? It's not like that we have to try and get back to the earlier one because they were there first. No. Justice is again, so it's very strange, right? So probably if you're going to be a modern day Kantian, you want to try and find ways that are faithful to what the project is about, that get rid of these weird, sharp edges. Right? So, Darren?
Kant's argument feels like Hobbes and Rousseau had a baby. It really does. Because it's like a Frankenstein monster of things I hated about Rousseau's arguments and the things I hated about Hobbes' argument. And it said, boom.
One beautiful baby.
Yeah, what a beautiful baby. I don't like the conclusion that you can't really own your own property, even in the state of nature. I don't like it. I just don't like it. It doesn't feel right. It made me feel dirty. That's why I groaned when I saw it, because no one can unilaterally claim with something right. So I just groaned. I don't like it. Pineapples.
So, I mean, you can own some things, right, Kant? So you can own things like provisionally. Ripstein says, for example, like the problem is there's two ways you can own things. You can own things by sort of by your physical possession of it, right? So you eat it, it's inside your body. You can't really take the apple out of my stomach anymore without hurting my body. And I do have a right to my body because I don't have to claim that against you. That's there already, right? Now, so I own that, right? Now maybe if I own the apple in my hand, you can't snatch it without snatching it out of my hand, and thereby you're doing something to my body as well as to the apple, right? But now when I put the apple away and I go to my job or whatever, I do something else, right? And you come around and there's the apple, then he thinks it's a different matter, right? Because if I claim what Kant calls intelligible possession, so really just sort of a right in the more general sense, over the apple, such that even when I'm not around physically to hold it or ingest it or something, you still have to stay away from it. Right? Now I'm starting to claim things outside of me. And the Kantian intuition that maybe you don't share, but that's what Kantians who defend this, what gets them going, I think, is they think, well, what really matters for all social contract theorists, Locke, Hobbes, Kant, is you start with this position of natural equality between individuals. Right? No one has more authority or power than another, morally speaking. Okay, so one question is, how do we get from that situation to a state in which some people claim authority over others? Right? The other question is, for the Kantians, they think, well, okay, but that's not the only problem. The other problem is, so now we have this property right stuff, right? I say, this table is mine. How am I not claiming that I get to tell you what's right and what's wrong? Right? Because I'm saying, well, it's now, by my saying, this is mine, right? That's just something I made up, right? I thought that, and then the words came out of my mouth. Right? That's just me, nothing else. I'm telling you that something that was yesterday right for you to do, which is take this table, now is wrong for you to do. And the motivation behind that is, well, if you start with thinking about natural equality, really, that's really suspicious. Right? And so Kant they think, well, okay, so that gives you really real big problems in the state of nature. We'll see a version of this with the disagreement argument in a bit. But gives you problems in the state of nature, because in the state of nature, it really is all me against you. Right? Not just tables. It's all sorts of things when we have a conflict. Right? Let's say you grant that I can claim the table. There's no weird moral magic going on. I can do this. I claim a table. Maybe that's equal with you because you can also claim your table. Right? So we're similar still. Okay, well now we have the table, and now I said, Cameron, you're standing too close to my table. Right? My right to my table says you don't get to stand too close to it. Right? And you say, no, I'm not touching it. It gives you a right that I don't touch the table, but I can stand as close as I want without touching it. No, you stand too close. No, I don't stand too close. Right? Now we have a disagreement. Okay, well, how good is my table if you can stand like this, right? Like super close, right? Maybe that ruins the table because I can't put things on it anymore because you're hovering over it, right? So it's not a ridiculous view, my view. Your view is clearly not ridiculous, right? Although, well, it's not obvious if you can hover. Who is right? Well, how do we settle this in the state of nature?
According to Kant, you can't, because there's no arbiter to settle
Right.
it.
The only way I can do it is by trying to enforce my will on you, right? And so that's just unilateral. That's just me claiming to be, you and I are supposed to be equals, but when push comes to shove, I'm the one in charge. Right? And so that's a problem. So that's what gets the Kantian thing going, I think. Tyler?
It almost seems like because no one can be wrong, no one can be right, in a weird way. Like, 'cause
Yeah, no, that's a nice way to put it. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because to say that you're wrong is to claim that your judgment is worth less than mine, and that's ruled out by equality. Right? But that's the disagreement version, right? The first version, that's the version that people take from Kant. It's also a version that's prominent in Rousseau, by the way. But the first version, the version he officially gives, is all about the claiming of external things, right? So maybe that's more problematic. All right. Here's two questions. Well, we've talked a little bit about it. Like, is this idea at all plausible? So do you think it's plausible that I can't claim anything? So you say no, but why? Like, okay, Kant says, can't impose any new obligations on you. If you've read Ripstein, you'll see that Simmons has a passage in this where he gives some examples. Can you think of any examples, maybe, from Simmons or yourself, where we can impose new obligations on others? Unilaterally, like I do something that changes the obligations you have. But I do something that changes your obligations.
Maybe a situation where you're exerting some kind of control over them, like a hostage situation. I mean, that's the only thing that seems to make sense where you really know.
Yeah, can you think of an example that involves something that's just generally, that's okay, right? Like morally speaking. No. That doesn't involve wronging others.
Well, I think the Simmons example that he gave about utilizing public goods, I thought that was a little better than what Ripstein gave him credit for. So, like, if there's a group of us playing basketball,
Right.
that doesn't give you the right to
March onto the court.
yeah, just like start interfering with games and say, hey, this is a public good, public park. Like I can utilize it as much as you can. He was saying, that Ripstein countered and said you can't build a house there. Everybody has to respect the rules of basketball or whatever. But it still seems like you're unilaterally enforcing your will because let's say you wanted to, let's say you were drawing chalk on the basketball court, and there's a group of 10 of us want to play basketball, and we throw you out of there. Like, well, I mean, you weren't utilizing the proper rules of the basketball court, but it's to say that we wanted to play basketball on the basketball court, we were right, and that's why I kind of got on Ripstein's counter with him saying, like, that would be okay. But, I don't know, that seemed kind of compelling, you know?
Right, yeah, so yeah, Simmons gives the following type of examples, right? So Kant says you can't unilaterally choose to put a new obligation on others, right? And Simmons says, yeah, you can. Here are some examples. One example being just there's a public basketball court. One moment I'm free to go there and just shoot some free throws, right? Then I show up, I show up at noon, nobody's there. I get to shoot 3 throws. Show up at 1, there is a group of people playing basketball. Now I'm like if I'm going to be a nice person, right? I'm morally obligated to not just go and walk onto their court and start shooting free throws. Be wrong because they showed up first. They get to use the court with limits or whatever, right? But there you go, right? For a while, I have the obligation to stay off the court, and I didn't have it before, and that wasn't a law. That wasn't that was just people deciding unilaterally we're going to play here, right? If I was there first shooting, they'd have to wait till it was done, so, right? Unilaterally. Yeah, Ripstein says, yeah, okay, nice example, but that really only, all these examples, they presuppose the state already because it's a public court and the public court has to be built for a purpose. So that's been, the law has sort of infused it with that purpose and we're just following those rules. Right? I agree with you. I think Simmons is in the right here. There are other cases. He doesn't give the better examples than the ones he gives. Here's one. I crossed the street, right? Drivers did not have an obligation to hit the brake. Now they do have an obligation to hit the brake, right? There you have one. Maybe if I shave my hair, right? You don't have an obligation not to touch my hair without my consent, because I don't have any hair, right? Then I grow my hair again. There's your obligation not to touch my hair with it. That's a new one, right? Because you didn't have it, now you have it, right? And you can spin this all manner of ways, right? Like there's all sorts. Maybe you can, if you choose to have a child, right? There's a whole new source of obligations that just you foist upon the world unilaterally. That doesn't require the government's consent, or better not, right? So it seems that there is all sorts of counterexamples here. Yeah, so I agree. I think that's not possible. Ripstein tries to resist it, but I've actually, this is just some of what we just talked about. Okay, the premise 3 is the one we talked about. That's the one about assurance, right? It's unreasonable for me to expect you to respect my rights unless I can somehow give an assurance that I will respect your rights. And it's unreasonable for you to expect me to respect your rights unless you can somehow give me assurance that you and other people will respect my rights in return. That's sort of general respecting. Like I said, it's the linchpin, right? It's not. One example that Kant gave was the Hobbes one, right, where you don't have to wait to find out whether other people will respect your rights. I'm not quite sure why this would be some sort of requirement. Maybe Cameron's example would be a good one, right? There needs to be some type of assurance for the rights to property to be a protection. But then maybe, well, what if everybody sort of agrees with these contracts, right? Like, why is that not good enough to get the assurance of the? We know Kant thinks it's not good enough. We need to do the melting instead of the tying together. But why, right? What if everyone just chooses not to violate any rights? What if everybody like really robustly chooses? Right? Like we all sort of have we have a contract. We say like we are now hereby committing ourselves, and we're very reliable people.
But he's saying that just because you have a claim doesn't necessarily, it's unreasonable for you to believe there's a claim to be imposed on it as well. Like that's kind of what I get out of it. But to me, that's exactly what a claim is. Like
Right.
it has a duty with it, you know? And it would be unreasonable not to expect a duty like accompanied with a claim. So that's the whole idea behind claim, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, he's saying that, no, it's a great point. And it's not just your opinion. Kant agrees with his opinion, right? That's how he defines rights as imposing obligations on others. So, yeah, what he's saying is it's unreasonable for you to think that you can impose a claim or you can really claim a right by yourself. Because you know you can't pull off the second part. Right? If you can't pull off the second part, then it's just the same thing, so you can't pull off the first.
Yeah, but like if you say like I can't make you respect the duty, like I mean
Yeah.
yeah, I can't make you respect the duty that you have to me if I have a claim against you, but like that's the whole aspect of it though. Just because I can't force you to respect the duty that's imposed upon you doesn't necessarily mean that I still don't have to claim. You know, like for example, like an infant can't enforce the fact that you respect its claim right against you that you don't kill it. It doesn't mean you don't have a duty there as well. It just means that, I mean, if there's a claim, there's a political duty imposed, and regardless if I can force you to like comply with that or not, it's still there. You're still bound by it.
Right.
Like I'm not the one binding you by it. Like you're morally obligated to be bound by it.
Yes, to me this sounds right. So, but I'm generally of Lockean persuasions. The Kantians think that maybe yeah, I understand what you're saying, but there's still this extra layer that Cameron was referring to that's missing, right? Whereas if we really want to live with each other in justice, and not just in sort of, yeah, the real deal. Like, I don't know, like they always think capital J, capital R, like it's German justice. I need a big book and sort of like have it like justice. To be able, if we're going to live together like that, instead of just sort of each in our individual views about what our rights are or what we might claim against each other, or just hope that this mysterious external truth about rights and duties that exists is going to be respected. But we're going to have real protections, which the idea is there is something more justice-y about or something, right? Then we need more than just that, for better or worse. That's about the best case I can make for it. So, you seem unpersuaded.
No, I mean, I can always make the counter that saying, like, if you have this external force of capital J justice standing there with the threat to enforce the fact that you respect your duty to my claim, to me that seems almost just more like an imposter of justice because you're threatened to comply with this rather than to actually comply with justice in a precise sense, inform
Right.
justice rather than just go ahead and you have somebody standing like off in the background saying, if you don't respect the claim that he has against you, then we're gonna force you to. That doesn't seem like justice.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Sorry? Yeah, and it's interesting with the earlier, if you compare it to Kant's moral philosophy, he says things very much like that, right? So the only truly good act, morally good act, is one that you do out of sense of duty. Right? If you just respect other people's rights because you're afraid of the law, then, all right, that's nice, but that's not really acting morally, right? But if you just do it because you think other people will think nicely of you and you want others, then I think that's still not good enough. You have to do it because it's the right thing to do. Right? That should be your proper mode. Like that's the purest motivation. That's really the only pure motivation. So yeah, this seems to cut against it somewhat. Yeah.
I guess this is why this confused me because I remember I took an ethical issues in business class and we were more discussing the fluffier side of Kant, and then this Kant I got right here, it seems to be like whoa, it's not the Kant I remember. At least perpetual peace Kant is far from perpetual peace Kant.
Yeah, although, well, you'll see because the whole debate about perpetual. So Kant predicts that if you have all these different states in which all the wills together are united, especially if they're democratically united, that there will be peace between these two. But note that he thinks there is a state of nature between these countries, but you don't need yet another higher. This is a controversial thing, right? Like, why doesn't Kant think that necessarily, right, since this is a state of nature, you need another civil union across the whole world? And he thinks a federation of states, just states that are living side by side, is good enough, right? So he's dealing with with similar issues. And he thinks that you can get at the international level, there's something different about states living side by side than individuals living side by side. Anyway, not to get too far afield. All right, so this is what I basically talked about. So what if they really promise? What if we robustly commit? What if we're really truly reliable? Like you know a person, you know he would never do this, right? Why is that not good enough as assurance? Kant owes us an answer because he wants the state to be necessarily required. So we need to know what's so good about the state that we don't get from people who we know would never do this, especially since we know the state sometimes does do this. Right? We need an answer. Anyway. All right. Very quickly, we won't get all the way through this, but I'm just going to set this up for next time. That first argument was about property, okay? Claiming something external to be mine. And next time we go faster through this because it has the same structure, but there is a different version of the argument. That's the one that Ripstein jumps on in the last part of the chapter, the third section, and so on, which is about not the impossibility of unilateral appropriation, which seems to run into these counter examples of crossing the street and the basketball court and so on. Right? But and the Hobbesian claim that really why we need this assurance is because you don't have to wait to find out if other people are nice enough. But replace it with something that depends on not ideas of appropriation, but on ideas about disagreement. Yeah. So here's the section. So let's read that together and then we'll call it a day. Later on, this is in 44, you'll see this is when we've moved from private right to public right. So there's account of the state. It's one of the first sections of his theory of the state. It says, talking about the state of nature. It's not experience from which we learn of human beings' maximum of violence and their malevolent tendency to attack one another before external legislation endowed with power appears. External legislation endowed with power, that's the state, right? However well-disposed law-abiding men may be, so like the nicest people in the world, right? However nice they may be, it still lies a priori, so that's just like before we know anything, I just mean like by the concept of what it is that we're talking about. In the rational idea of such a condition, one that is not rightful, so it means just the state of nature without a civil society. So necessarily in a state of nature, before a lawful public condition is established, individual human beings, peoples, and states, there's your perpetual peace stuff, right, can never be secure against violence from one another, since each has its own right to do, emphasis, what seems right and good to it, and not to be dependent on another's opinion about this. This is the one sentence I talked about that Ripstein jumps on. Kantians of today, they love this stuff. Like this is what they're all about. And this really is this idea that I was talking about earlier, right? Like we have to dispute about what it means to own something. Or it doesn't have to be necessarily about ownership. It can be about anything, right? It might be about, say, we think that morally speaking, we have a right to privacy, right? Okay, well, how much? Is standing really close to me an invasion of my privacy? Like, is standing 10 yards from me an invasion of my privacy? What about 10 yards, but following me around 24 hours a day at 10 yards, right? It's not clear, right? So I might have some ideas about this. You might have some ideas about this. If we get down to the nitty-gritty, very likely they won't be the same ideas. Now, in a state of nature, even if we're the nicest possible people, if we have different ideas, which given that we're reasonable, rational people who like to think, right? We come up with ideas, and they'll probably be because we are trying to think each for our own different ideas. In a state of nature, it's just you and me and everybody else for themselves. How we're going to settle this? Well, there is only one way to settle it, which is just you got to do what seems right and good to you, right? And I got to do whatever seems right and good to me, right? So I think really hard about this, and I don't want to be an instigator, but you really this is violating my privacy, and then at some point I can try and use force against you. Right? So that's what he means here. He's saying it's just in the idea of a condition like that violence is available, even if we never use it. We might be the nicest people, might be a bunch of Mahatma Gandhis, but it's available to us. And that's going to be so this is a very different argument, right? It doesn't require it's not me claiming something external to be mine. It's just like we have different opinions, and if we're going to respect each other as equals, whose opinions each matter the same, none is better than the other, then we have to recognize that in a state of nature, all we can do is, in the end of the day, claim that our opinion is best, better than others. Because what can I do but act on my own view? Right? And he says the state of nature is bad in that regards because everybody ultimately has to claim some type of superiority to everybody else. And so if you really want equality, we need to have a state in which We're no longer each of us superior to everybody else, but we're all equals, united through the law. So, all right, we'll get to that next time. It'll get better. Oh, one thing. Sorry, this is an announcement not from me, but, well, one from me and one from the department. So two real quick things. One is next Thursday after class there will be another talk, which is the talk by Professor Husak on drug policy. That was supposed to be 2 weeks ago, but then the snow interfered, or 4 weeks ago. Instead of 4, like 2 weeks ago, it'll be at 5 this time, 5 p.m. But I highly recommend coming. He's a very engaging speaker, and he's like the sort of internationally the guy in philosophy and drug policy. So. Second, just a heads up, our department has a thing called the Schwerk Award, which is something available to majors only. So if you're not a major, it doesn't apply to you. But if you are a major, I highly recommend that you submit a paper. It's basically an award for the best philosophy paper that year. We often don't get very many submissions, so your chances are pretty decent of getting something. Now, it's nice to get the award. You get a little plaque, and we get applause and so on. You also get money. So there's money things. And it's not an insignificant amount of money. We've had the last couple of years, we have winners and then the honorable mention. Last year, the winner won $1,500. It depends a little bit on how many prizes are turned out. Sometimes it's 1,000, sometimes it's 1,500. But so I'd submit a paper, and I make more money than you guys. So, so do that. The department's website has a little outline on, like instructions. I think the end of March is the deadline. So if you have a good paper from last term, for example, or you want to get a head start on the paper for this term and start writing and then submit it, what do you have to lose? Nothing but a chance to a bunch of money. So do that. Okay. Yeah, and you need a number of credit hours. So if you just you think, oh, I'll just enroll to be a major just so I can get the money, then you're out of luck. Not that you would do any of that.
Could it be that it's trying to find a moral justification for the state? Because the unilateral lives, that whenever a new person comes into it, from outside the society, or being born, then they have to come with